Welcome to the Medical Center Hour. I'm Marcia Day Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities here at the UVA School of Medicine. Happy to welcome you to this program, which is produced by the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities. Our program today, Sex, Sin, and Science, Syphilis in America, is a history of the health sciences lecture. It's pretty well known and accepted today that biology, physiology, and medical science are not the only determinants of how we experience, understand, and react to diseases. In the case of a disease associated with sex, social and cultural factors, including moral and religious views, figure especially prominently in our construction of a disease and its experience. Indeed, such sociocultural factors often result in powerful stigmatization of both the disease and those who contract and suffer from it. Syphilis can be an excellent case example to help us appreciate stigmatized disease in a broader human context and in the context of both our social and biomedical responses. 2 weeks ago, our Medical Center Hour with historian Susan Reverby examined the syphilis studies undertaken by United States Public Health Service physicians in Guatemala in the late 1940s. Studies that were, like the research begun earlier with African American men in Tuskegee, unethical and inhumane in their design and performance. This Medical Center Hour offers something of a sociocultural backstory to the Tuskegee and Guatemala syphilis research. If we delve into the story of syphilis in America, from colonial times to the present, even inquire into the disease's origins and earlier spread in Europe, how might this help us to better understand, though certainly not to excuse, what motivated American public health officials to mount campaigns against syphilis and to undertake the Tuskegee and Guatemala experiments? Here to enlighten us about syphilis is Professor John Parascandola, former historian for the United States Public Health Service and now professor of history at the University of Maryland. In 2008, he published a book tracing the history of and sociocultural response to syphilis in the United States, Sex, Sin, and Science, A History of Syphilis in America. He writes on fascinating, if sobering, even socially macabre topics. His new book, which will come out next month, is on a history of arsenic. We've invited also infectious disease, public health, and global health specialist Rebecca Dillingham to offer a brief response. We're delighted that today's program coincides with Dr. Dillingham's second day as the newly appointed director of UVA's Center for Global Health. She spent her first day at the Global Health Initiatives Conference with President Clinton and President Obama and candidate Governor Romney yesterday. So, welcome back. As our speakers may indicate, syphilis and other sexually transmitted infections are not simply relics of the past, but rather remain very much with us today. And so we've provided, courtesy of the local health department, an extra handout with some of the latest statistics and related information. Our partner for this Medical Center Hour is the History of the Health Sciences Lecture Series, which we coordinate with Joan Echtenkamp-Klein in historical collections at the Health Sciences Library. And now, John Parascandola and Rebecca Dillingham. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I've spoken at UVA before, and it's always a pleasure to come and visit you and talk before this audience. An audience even more distinguished for Rebecca than yesterday's audience. Shortly after Columbus came back from the New World, returned to Spain in 1492, a terrible new disease, or what appeared to be a new disease, appeared in Europe. It was previously unknown. It frequently began, as they described it at the time, in the private parts of the victim. And its first appearance was in Naples in 1495 during the beginning of the so-called Italian Wars, where France had invaded the Italian city-states. In 1495, Charles, King of France, with an army made up largely of mercenaries, laid siege to and captured the city of Naples. This prompted a response by the Pope, who put together a League of Venice, as it was called, which included Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, in addition to the city-states of Milan and Venice, to try to drive the French out of Italy. Charles was afraid that he was going to be sort of cornered in Naples by these opposing forces, so he marched his army north to Lombardy. Oops, the wrong one. He engaged the forces of the League at what was called the Battle of Fornovo on July 5th, 1495. The battle didn't go well for the French, so Charles decided to abandon this effort at Italian conquest and retreated to his own country. When he did that, the mercenary army that he had built up with soldiers from various countries disbanded, soldiers returned to their respective countries, and they carried with them this new disease, which, as they say, had first really begun to show up at the Battle of Naples. In fact, Charles himself became a victim of the disease. An early description of the disease, which was provided by doctors in for the Venetian troops at the Battle of Fornovo, spoke of pustules on the face and body and intense pain in various parts of the body. Less than a decade after that battle, the disease had spread throughout all of Europe. This is a disease, of course, that came to be identified as syphilis. I should note that obviously the understanding, characterization of diseases at that time was far different than our own. Some people have pointed out that references that we find from the period to epidemics of what was often called the French disease, although the French preferred to call it the Neapolitan disease, that some of these may have included other diseases besides syphilis. And also, no doubt, the disease itself has changed over time as microorganisms have mutated, and the disease seems to have been, from the descriptions, even more serious than later forms. But for our purposes today, we will just look at this and not try to get into the niceties of whether each of these descriptions was actually syphilis. It seems clear that syphilis was present at this time, even if every epidemic identified as the pox, as syphilis was also often called, may not have been just syphilis. Now, many of you probably know that the disease first received the name syphilis as opposed to the great pox, which was to differentiate it from smallpox or French disease, received the name syphilis from an Italian physician, Fracastoro, in a poem that he published in 1530. And that poem was extremely popular, published in various languages, translated into various languages, and helped to spread the use and establish the use of the name syphilis. In the poem, the shepherd Syphilis blasphemes the sun god, and as punishment, the sun god curses not only him, but the entire earth with this new disease, making Syphilis the shepherd the first victim. Now, Fracastoro was a physician, and he didn't really mean for people to take this story literally. It was a poem, and he actually published separately a treatise, a more serious medical treatise, which gave a more naturalistic explanation of the disease. But in any case, the name of the shepherd, Syphilis, came eventually to denote the disease. There were some scholars at the time who tried to relate this new malady with the disease descriptions in the ancient literature, trying to say this was not necessarily a new disease, maybe just a variant of something we already know, but by far the majority of the early commentators argued that the pox was indeed a new disease never before seen in Europe. Well, if that was the case, as most people thought, how did this disease come into being? Why had it suddenly showed up in Europe at this time? One of the initial reactions to this malady was the idea that it was a punishment from God, that people had become too lax in following God's laws. People had blasphemed God. Syphilis blasphemed the sun god. And the Holy Roman Emperor, for example, issued an edict in 1495, the same year the disease really first described, saying that this evil pox had been sent by God as a punishment for blasphemy. This woodcut shows the baby Jesus sending out arrows of disease to inflict upon humans. Another popular explanation was that the disease was caused by astrological factors. Particularly, there was a German physician named Grunpeck who wrote about this, whose work was influential. He, of course, admitted that ultimately it was God's will that was the cause of the disease, but he saw astrology as the kind of second or physical cause of the disease. A particular alignment of the stars and the planets had led to this disease. Now, although syphilis, as I said, first appeared in Europe quite soon after Columbus returned to Spain from his first voyage to America, it doesn't appear that anyone, at least in print, attempted to connect the two events until 1526, when a Spanish nobleman, Oviedo y Valdez, who was at the royal court when Ferdinand and Isabella greeted Columbus on his return, published a book called The Natural History of the Indies. In a statement in the book addressed to the King of Spain, to whom he dedicated the work, Oviedo wrote, "Your Majesty may take it as certain that this malady, the bubas," which was another name for syphilis, "comes from the Indies, where it is very common among the Indians, but not so dangerous in those lands as it is in our own. The first time this sickness was seen in Spain was after Admiral Don Christopher Columbus had discovered the Indies and returned from those lands. Some Christians among those who went with him and took part in the discovery, and the many more who made the second trip, brought back this scourge, and from them it was passed on to others." And others came to support this theory. Particularly influential was a book by a French physician, Astruc, who made the strong case that the disease originated on the West Indian island of Santo Domingo, where he believed the crew of Columbus had first come into contact with it. Now, the American origin theory became quite popular in Europe, for one thing. Instead of arguing amongst themselves whether it was the French or the Italians or whoever who caused the disease, blame it on the outsiders, blame it on those Indians. And this view tended to dominate for quite some time. And many people think, historians think, that it was also popularized by Oviedo himself for reasons that went beyond just his beliefs about the disease that I'll get to in a minute. This issue has never really been definitively resolved. People still argue today over whether the disease originated in the Americas. Maybe it never will be resolved. And I can't, of course, discuss it all in detail. I might just say that, you know, during the 19th century, when paleontology comes to the fore as a science, people began to look for evidence in the paleontological record. Since the historical record didn't seem to be able to resolve this issue, people looked for lesions in bones that might have been signs of syphilis, both in pre-Columbian America and in Europe in that same period. And over the course of the 20th century, there have been various discoveries, and the argument has gone back and forth. Every time there was a new discovery, somebody challenged an earlier view. The latest paleontological evidence of just a few years ago seemed to suggest that syphilis was not brought to Europe from America, but existed in the Old World in some form. A disease like yours or something that may have mutated. But just as it looked like, you know, that evidence was fairly definitive, more recently there's been genetic evidence by trying to trace genetics in South American Indians, which has argued in favor of the American origin of disease. But again, as I say, the issue is not resolved. The most popular remedy for treating syphilis was mercury, which was either administered externally as a salve or internally as a pill or potion, or even in fumigation, like in a special chamber, where you see this person with mercury being thrown onto the flames to produce mercury vapor, which, as we can imagine, wasn't entirely healthy. But anyway, other drugs were tried, many other drugs, but mercury continued to dominate syphilis therapy up until the beginning of the 20th century. The only challenger, and even that was eventually eclipsed, but in the early days, mercury did have some competition from a plant, a tree from the New World, the guaiacum or gaiac, a tree that was native to the West Indies. And this view that this tree might work was given a boost by the popularity of the American origin theory, because at the time it was widely believed that God often placed the remedies for a disease in areas where the disease flourished. So it seemed reasonable, since many people thought the disease came from the Americas, that the cure would come from there too. I mentioned Oviedo was the one who really popularized the idea that the disease came from the Americas. At least one historian suggested that he may not have been entirely disinterested in putting forth this view, because he managed to get from the king a monopoly on the import of the gaiac wood. And so it was certainly to his advantage to have people believe that the disease came from the Americas. Soon after the disease first appeared, a number of commentators began to associate its spread with sexual activity. And by the 16th century, it's pretty widely believed that this is the main way the disease is transmitted. This view that the disease was sexually transmitted, however, was not gender neutral. Women, especially prostitutes and women who were viewed as being promiscuous, were generally assigned a major part of spreading the disease, and this was a view that remained largely unchanged for centuries. As early as 1497, there were medical writers warning men against having sex with women who were infected with syphilis, and the practice of singling out for quarantine women with venereal disease began early in the history of syphilis. Now, whether or not syphilis existed in America before Columbus arrived, we do know that it was certainly present in the New World by the end of the 15th century. We do have some reports from Columbus and others of what appears to be the disease syphilis already, as I say, by the end of the 15th century. So whether it had been there before in the Indies, for example, or whether it actually was brought from Europe rather than the other way around, we don't know, but we do know that the disease is present in America basically from the time of Columbus's discovery. By the 16th century, we're getting reports, particularly from New Spain, because of course Spain was the first country to extensively colonize in the Americas, about syphilis. For example, there is a report of a hospital that was built specifically for syphilis patients near the city of Mexico in 1539. And one of the skeletons that's been excavated at the site of the English settlement of Jamestown from the early 17th century is that of a young man of African descent, which shows signs of tertiary syphilis, meaning he'd had the disease for a time. We don't know, though, whether or not he acquired the disease, in the settlement, or whether he already had it in coming over. As more colonies get established in North America, and as these colonies grow in size, reports of syphilis, not surprisingly, become more common. For example, there's a report of a relatively minor syphilis outbreak in Boston in 1646 that is made by the governor of the colony, John Winthrop. And in the early 1700s, the famous Boston cleric Cotton Mather, who had already complained about the presence of houses of prostitution in the city, now issued a complaint about how many cases there were of syphilis, which he referred to as a secret disease. And the reason for that is because he said that very often death records covered up the disease, that it was reported as tuberculosis or something else, because the family and the physician who served them were not anxious to identify the disease as syphilis. By the late 18th century, when you're getting a number of larger cities in the American colonies, syphilis is beginning to be seen as more of a problem, along with gonorrhea, the other major venereal disease of the period. And this is particularly so in seaport cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston. We do have, statistics from this period are not great, but we do have some evidence that, for example, at the end of the 18th century, about 10% of the people entering almshouses in Philadelphia were infected with one or another venereal disease. And it was not only the European settlers and their descendants who were plagued by syphilis. The disease spread to other populations as well, such as the slave population. Obviously, sex between white masters and slaves, particularly between the male masters and female slaves, often forced upon the females, helped to spread the disease among the slave population. And the same thing happened with the Indians. Sex between settlers and the Indians, including even intermarriage, was not uncommon, and this led to the transmission of syphilis both ways between these populations. For example, syphilis seems to have been introduced into the California Indian population by Hispanic settlers in the latter part of the 18th century. We also know that syphilis was one of the medical problems that confronted Lewis and Clark on their 1804 to 1806 Corps of Discovery expedition. We know from descriptions of their supplies, for example, that their medical supplies included 3 mercury compounds that were used against syphilis. And also we have the journals of the explorers, which describe frequent sexual encounters between the members of the expedition and the Indian women that they met along the way. And Lewis records using mercury to treat several of his men afflicted with syphilis in 1806. And then there are other reports in the journals of both men, too, about cases of venereal disease. War has traditionally provided a stimulus to the spread of venereal disease. Soldiers are far from home and family. Troops frequently attract the presence of prostitutes. And we do have recorded cases going back to the Revolutionary War, for example, in this country, of colonists being treated for syphilis and gonorrhea. By the time of the Civil War, venereal disease in the military was seen as a very serious problem. And the Army was very concerned on both sides about the number of brothels in cities which were near where battles were taking place or where soldiers were being trained. For example, there were reportedly more than 400 brothels in Washington, D.C. alone during the Civil War. Supposedly there were so many prostitutes around General Joseph Hooker's troops that they were referred to as Hooker's Brigade. This, by the way, was an obvious play on the word hooker, because that word actually was already by then a slang term for a prostitute. Sometimes people have said that the name came from General Hooker, but it appears to have been in use before then and was just being used here, as I say, as a kind of play on words. In all, there were over 70,000 cases of syphilis among Union troops, and more than 100,000 cases of other VD, mostly gonorrhea. We don't have as good a records for the Confederate troops, but evidence we have suggests it was pretty widespread. Venereal disease was pretty widespread in both armies. The armies in the Union-occupied cities of Memphis and Nashville actually instituted a system of legalized, regulated prostitution in an effort to try to control venereal disease, because this way prostitutes would have to register, they would be inspected regularly by physicians, which was something that was very common in many European countries, but not in this country, and that experiment didn't survive the end of the war. Concerns about venereal disease increased substantially in the late 19th and early 20th century for a number of reasons. For one thing, there was an increased understanding of the long-term effects of syphilis, recognizing that ultimately, in the stage of tertiary syphilis, it could lead to paralysis and death. There were also concerns about threats to the family, particularly middle-class family. During this period, people were delaying marriage often to a later age. They were having smaller families, or at least middle-class white Americans were having smaller families. There was an increase in the divorce rate, and syphilis was seen as a kind of family poison. A lot of times it was pointed out, for example, that a husband who goes and visits a prostitute may well get infected, and then he's going to pass that on to his innocent wife, and that might lead to a child being born with congenital syphilis or being stillborn because of the disease. And these were concerns that were exacerbated by the growth of the eugenics movement and also the huge tide of immigrants coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe. So Americans of Anglo-Saxon stock are already fearing that their numbers are going to be overwhelmed by people they consider to be unfit, the Southern and Eastern Europeans, the poor, the lower classes, etc. And the thought that many American men of the middle class might be out there getting syphilis and poisoning their race was disconcerting. Physicians tended to think of syphilis as a hereditary disease because you pass it on from mother to child. But we, of course, know that's a congenital disease. It's not, we don't inherit it in the genes, but it was widely believed that people often inherited a tendency to the disease. It was believed that arriving immigrants frequently are infected with the disease. Many Americans wanted to blame the foreign-born for the rise in prostitution. They thought, most prostitutes might have been foreign-born. So all of these factors increase alarms about venereal disease, particularly syphilis, the most serious one. And in this same period, early 20th century, is when you begin to get a strong connection of syphilis to racism. Not that no one had raised these issues before, but in the early 20th century, as a part of this whole concern about eugenics and all, you get increasing concerns about the connection of syphilis to African Americans, who were seen by many white Americans as being sexually immoral, lacking in hygiene, and somehow especially prone to syphilis. And of course, this is the period, 1915, of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which tends to depict the African American men as vicious and as sexually desiring white women. Organizations designed to combat problems of prostitution and venereal disease spring up in the U.S. in the progressive era, the most prominent being the American Social Hygiene Association, founded in 1914, which played a key role in working with the federal government in efforts to control VD in the period, particularly in World War I. And by the time of World War I, several important discoveries had been made that helped in the battle against syphilis. For one thing, in 1905, the organism that caused the disease, the spirochete, was discovered. So people now knew the cause. And just 1 year later, August Wasserman developed a test for diagnosis based on antibodies in the blood. And then finally in 1910, a few years after Wasserman's test, Paul Ehrlich introduced salvarsan, the first reasonably effective drug for the treatment of syphilis. Salvarsan is an organic arsenic compound. It's by no means an ideal drug, had toxic side effect. Treatment was very prolonged. You usually had to get weekly injections for a year or more, but still, it had some effect in controlling syphilis, as opposed to earlier compounds like mercury, which probably really did little. So physicians now have more tools at their disposal for diagnosing syphilis, for treating it by the time World War I breaks out. And as always, during wartime, concerns about VD and about prostitution increased, especially concerns about infection of the troops, which could harm the war effort. I mentioned earlier the association of syphilis with sex is not gender neutral, women getting the major part of the blame. And we see this still going on in the 20th century, because one of the steps taken by the US government to try to protect troops and essential war workers is to detain infected women in areas near military camps, often without any due process. And some historians have estimated that as many as 30,000 women were incarcerated under this World War I program. And if you want a good view of this, read a relatively recent novel by a man named Michael Lowenthal called Charity Girl. Women who had sex with soldiers and were not prostitutes or didn't charge money were often referred to as charity girls, which tells the story of one of these women who does get a disease after a one-night stand with a soldier, and when she tries to go and find him at the camp where he's stationed, she is picked up by the authorities, forced to undergo physical examination, and when she's found to have a disease, she's put into one of these detention centers. And the book does even though it's a novel, it does a pretty good job, it's based on historical evidence, of describing it. When the US enters World War II, you again had these kinds of concerns. And you could see it in the many posters that are issued and films. I've done a study of the films as well. Most of them aimed at men, particularly in the armed forces and defense industries, warning them against having sex with prostitutes and so-called women of easy virtue. Now, Thomas Parent, who was Surgeon General at the time, had already initiated a VD campaign against syphilis from the time of his appointment as Surgeon General in 1936. He had earlier headed the PHSVD division, and so this was a special interest of his. He spoke very openly about syphilis, which was not common at the time, defying a kind of taboo that this is not a subject, for polite society. In fact, in one famous incident, at the last minute, when he was about to give a radio speech, he was told he couldn't use the word syphilis on the air. So he canceled the speech and maybe got more publicity out of that anyway. But after the US enters the war in 1941, the Public Health Service efforts increase. And once again, much of the blame, as I say, is placed on women. Military and public health officials come to believe that not only prostitutes, but promiscuous women who hang around the camp present this threat to servicemen and war industry workers. One article by 2 public health officials said, the promiscuous girl has come to be considered the major source of venereal infection. These authors complained of a lowering of moral standards, and I love this. They literally look back with what I can only say is nostalgia to the day, as they say, when a promiscuous woman would find her door painted with tar as the sign of disapproval of her amoral behavior. They seem to regret that we no longer did that. Journalists made sometimes ridiculous claims saying, for example, 90% of the Army's cases are traced to what they call amateur girls, tacky-wackies, victory girls, and good time charlottes. And as this poster says, she may look clean, but you can't tell from looking. Since prostitutes and promiscuous women were seen as a major source of VD, whenever VD is depicted in a poster in human form, it's always a woman. Never seen one of a man. In this poster, VD is shown as a woman marching as an ally with the leaders of the Axis countries. And that reflects the fact that promiscuous women who spread VD were likened to enemy saboteurs, the snipers, juke joint sniper up at the top there. And one of the steps that was taken was once again, like in World War I, to have a national system of quarantine, which was coordinated by the Public Health Service. They set up a series of VD quarantine hospitals for women. There were, by the end of the war, there were over 60 of them, mostly established near military training facilities or important war industry centers. These hospitals were known as rapid treatment centers. I'm going to skip through some of this quickly to finish up, because treatment was prolonged and unpleasant with Salvarsan. Public health officials were suspicious that the average prostitute, for example, was going to go back to the doctor every week. So by the time of World War I, rapid treatment methods were developed where you could, for example, put somebody in a hospital and over a period of days give them continuous intravenous drip or multiple injections. Now that, of course, required hospitalization and careful medical care, but they felt that they would more likely get results. So these rapid treatment centers were set up as a means of trying to protect the soldiers. And suspect women, if you wish, could be arrested on a variety of charges, vagrancy or even suspicion, or eating lunch by yourself. It could be suspicious, and then you could be sent to one of these hospitals, tested, and if you had the disease, quarantined. And there were all kinds of ways of providing pressure on the women. Besides the quarantine laws, if a woman didn't want to be treated once she got there, you could simply say, well, then we'll just keep you here indefinitely. Treatment could take from days to weeks. The PHS made a lot of efforts, including a film. I didn't have time to show you that, to say that the rapid treatment centers are hospitals, they're not prisons. In addition to medical treatment, while they were there, because it was a matter of weeks, they wanted to make sure the disease was really gone, they also tried to give the women some vocational training, particularly hoping that prostitutes would not go back to their old vocation, and counseling. Some camps had both African American and white patients, but their housing was segregated, as you might expect in this period. This is a time, of course, of the Tuskegee study and the Guatemala study, and really, I'm not going to go into these, you've heard about it, but just to say that obviously this is all a part of the whole racism that you could see not only within the PHS, but obviously within the broader society. There were some opponents who tried to opposed this idea of, it was discriminatory, it was focused on women, they often didn't use due process, but the argument was made it was a necessary wartime effort, and after all, if the government was going to take thousands of Japanese Americans and put them into camps, this was not going, they were not going to be deterred by this. Well, let me quickly say that after the war, the last one of these rapid treatment centers was closed in 1953. With the advent of penicillin, you could treat people more quickly and safely. In fact, when penicillin came in, people thought it was such a miracle that they felt we're going to defeat this disease, get rid of it, eradicate it. Well, that didn't happen. Syphilis rates did go down for a while, but by the latter part of the 50s, they're beginning to climb again. And William Brown, who was director of the VD program at the time, had to admit in 1959 that venereal disease was on the rise again, particularly syphilis. The Surgeon General, Luther Terry, in 1961, decided to follow the recommendations of a task force and initiate a 10-year program to eradicate the disease. But syphilis turned out to be harder to kill than Rasputin. In 1972, when it was supposed to have been eradicated according to that plan, there were more cases of syphilis reported than the year the campaign was initiated. And the number of cases went up and down. In the 70s, began to rise again about 1980, but by that time, and we'll hear a little about AIDS, the problem of syphilis was overshadowed by the rise of AIDS. Another Surgeon General, David Satcher, finally in 1999 started another syphilis eradication 10-year campaign. Once again, they had to revise the plan because syphilis was not gone. It's still with us today. Our best hope for getting rid of it, of course, would be the development of vaccine, but that's not proved to be an easy task. So really, I can't end the story in a way because the story of the history of syphilis in America is still going on. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I actually was a history major in college and really wanted to be an historian. I'm not, much to the dismay of my English professor father, but I value its lessons and its teachers immensely, so thank you very much. I'm just going to offer some very limited reflections on how lessons from efforts to control syphilis relate to our current efforts to control the HIV epidemic, particularly in light of some very interesting findings that came out last year and that were actually noted by the editor of Science, pictured here as the breakthrough of the year. And what were those findings? Those findings are that the treatment, which has been the cocktail, which you've probably all heard of, which has been really available since 1996 and much improved over the course of the first decade of the 21st century, is tremendously effective for individuals and has changed lives. What was published last year is a study that looked at serodiscordant couples, so couples in which one person has HIV and the other does not, in which they did not use condoms. These couples had the person who was HIV positive was under treatment and had an undetectable viral load, and the other person didn't have HIV. And what was found was that transmission of virus was essentially eliminated in the event that the person who was infected had an undetectable viral load. So that is actually really exciting because, as you probably know, we have not found a vaccine. We're still far from finding a vaccine. We have made efforts over decades to try to prevent the spread of HIV and have been largely unsuccessful, as I'll show you. So this idea that treating people who are HIV positive could actually be perhaps our most effective prevention method, is exciting. But as I'm going to argue, I think there's some important considerations and issues particularly related to the partnership between public health authorities and physicians going forward in terms of thinking about how we manage this. And I think that some of the lessons which Professor Parascandola derived from syphilis and sketched out in his book, well, not only sketched but detailed quite well in his book, are useful in thinking about this change, this sort of potential revolution in our efforts to control the epidemic of HIV. So I'm just going to very quickly sketch the state of the disease in the United States, and then, as I said, I'll reflect on some of those lessons from syphilis that I think are relevant to the management of the HIV epidemic. So we currently have about 1.2 million people who are over the age of 13 who live with HIV in the United States, and as I'll highlight again in the next slide, about a fifth of those people are unaware that they are infected. And unfortunately, approximately 50,000 people become infected with HIV in the United States each year, and that number has remained unchanged for about the past 12 years. So clearly we need to do something different in our efforts to prevent the spread of HIV. This is the most recent map available from the Kaiser Family Foundation about HIV infections by state. You'll note that I've put Virginia's rank as 11th with 1,272 new cases in the most recent year that's available of 2010. But this is a map that's not the typical kind of red and blue map you're used to looking at right now, and I would draw your attention to these blue areas, which represent areas in which there are the greatest number of new infections. Aren't too surprising. We would expect that in these population centers, California, Texas, the Northeast, that there might be a lot of HIV. But this is the area, and these are light blue, not without data. This blue area in the Southeast is concerning to me, and I know concerning to public health authorities around the country, because many of the strategies that have been developed, even if they haven't been completely successful for HIV prevention, have focused on urban populations. And in fact, the epidemic is growing fastest in the Southeast, right here, right in our backyard, and that presents some real challenges, because as much as there are no magic bullets in treatment, although we have some pretty darn good bullets for treatment in HIV now, there are definitely no magic bullets for prevention. And syphilis has definitely taught us that a complex group of interventions is needed, and I think that that group is going to be different for those people living in the Southeast with HIV or at risk for HIV that are indicated by that map. So just very quickly, I'm actually not going to belabor this at all. The thing that I would like you to notice is that of these million or so people that are living with HIV in the United States, 20% don't know that they're infected. And in fact, only about 19% of them have an undetectable viral load. So remember from that first slide that the study that was shown demonstrated that transmission is near impossible. We in the United States are very uncomfortable with any level of risk, but nonetheless, transmission is near impossible with an undetectable viral load. And only 19%, it is estimated, of people living with HIV have achieved that for a variety of reasons, many of which don't have anything to do with them being bad people, promiscuous people, or lazy people, but have a lot to do with the kinds of complex social issues that Professor Parascandola was mentioning to us, related to gender inequity, to stigma, to racism, and those are the kinds of things that we need to start addressing more creatively. So Professor Parascandola asks in his book Whether History is a Blueprint, And it can't be a blueprint, and I hope we're not destined to repeat it, but as I said before, I think there's a lot to learn from it. So in his book, he mentions that, he emphasizes that syphilis was very unfairly associated with particular groups like women and African Americans. Public health interventions posed very challenging questions in relation to civil liberties, and there's some shameful historical facts that we have to face in reference to the quarantine, and certainly in reference to the justification of some of the scientific studies we undertook in the name of public health. And finally, that stigma has prevented, in the case of syphilis, and I will argue with HIV as well, adequate discussion of risk factors, prevention strategies, and pursuit of treatment. So how are these related to HIV? So in HIV, certainly the perception is that HIV is associated with particular risk groups. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to say too much, but since 2006, the CDC has said that every adult between the age of 13 and 64, adolescent and adult, should have an HIV test at least once. So that's a mandate. That's been recommended for 6 years. Are we doing that? No. And the fact that we are not doing that lies a lot with stigma and with preconceived notions about who is at risk. And it is preventing us from decreasing that number of 20% of people that don't know that they're infected. Could we end the epidemic if all those who are currently living with HIV were treated? I think I'm going to leave this for the question and answer session, but I think there are interesting questions to think about in terms of what should we do about the people that are out of care? How should we think in the age of effective HIV treatment about testing? The health department here in Charlottesville has worked very hard to think about what to do when they get reports from people that there's been sexual exposure to HIV, and there has been and continues to be a very punitive approach of many public health authorities towards people who have exposed others to HIV. Very notorious case in Alabama right now, but Nick Madsen, who's in the audience, and others have really worked hard to try to really partner with people living with HIV to help them back into care and to help them find ways to disclose their status to others, to their partners in a safe way. Undetestable, I'm going to end here. This undetestable is kind of a strange word, and it reminds me of the patient who said it to me. She was one of my patients, and she was what she I think meant to say was whether the treatment that she was on was going to render her viral load undetectable. That's what she meant to say. But she really wanted to say this. She felt detestable. This is an incredibly lonely disease, a secret disease, as you mentioned, that creates a world in which it's very difficult for people living with HIV to pursue and receive the treatment that they need, and to, in that way, help to prevent the spread of this infection. So thank you very much.
Thank you both. And we have some time for the audience to offer questions and comments. We have two mics, one on each side of the auditorium, so that we can reach you with your comments and questions a little more quickly. Is there somebody who would like to start? This is a pretty fertile area for discussion, from everything from the historical to the epidemiological. There's a mic right there, right next to you. Yeah.
Just wondering how long a person needs to be treated with the drugs before they would get down to undetectable viral load.
So not for a terribly long time. Some people will reach undetectable within a month. We consider them a treatment failure if they have not reached that point in 6 months. The treatment, the treatment with Salvarsan, I actually hadn't known that it took that long. But the treatment needs to be maintained for life at this point with our current understanding. So while people are able to achieve undetectable relatively quickly, it's a long, lifelong commitment to therapy.
Please identify who you are, too.
Michelle Rehan, I'm a research coordinator here. You had mentioned these plans and strategies, one of which was 10 years, and then they extended it. I'm sure, especially in light of today's economy, there are ups and downs with how much funding can be permitted. But I'm wondering, are there any plans that were used abroad that decreased numbers? I mean, has there been any success somewhere that we know of? And what did that involve? Just briefly, if you don't mind.
There have been successes, and even here, but not to eradicate. These two campaigns I mentioned were to try to eradicate the disease. Now, the first one was a total failure because in the last year of the campaign there were more new cases than in the first year. The more recent campaign has resulted in some reduction. The problem is, relatively recently, within the last few years, some epidemiologists have begun to argue that part of the problem is that syphilis is sickly, and that what happens is that when the caseloads go up, there are a certain amount of people who develop some immunity to it, then if the disease is not present for some time, if those people begin to get older, and if the new disease, you're not getting as many new cases or whatever, that there's a reduction in the amount of people who have had some exposure to the disease. I'm not an epidemiologist, maybe you want, and this is not, I'm not saying it's accepted by everyone, but there were all kinds of efforts to explain why the disease went up at a certain period, mostly social, like, oh, it went up in the 60s because we had all those hippies and free sex and everything. But aside from this discussion of the possible cyclic nature of the disease, probably the figures that best have explained it are money. That is, the more money we put into it, the better we tend to do. When funding for syphilis control goes down, the cases go up. And I think that these other kinds of explanations of social issues, of what people, how people, what their attitudes towards sex are and all, don't seem to really. But again, maybe you have some thoughts on.
I'm not as familiar with different campaigns relative to syphilis. I know that the efforts internationally have often focused on preventing congenital syphilis, which has been very effectively prevented in the United States. However, I'm looking at one of my colleagues up there who worked on this in Zambia, and even that has been a difficult a problem internationally. There has not been as much attention to syphilis. If there are success stories about HIV, I always like to have the opportunity to offer a success story that happened in Haiti. We always hear bad things about Haiti. Haiti used to be the country in the it actually still is the country in the Western Hemisphere with the highest rates of HIV infection, but has been able to reduce those rates from 6% of the general population to under 2%, which is in fact lower than many estimates about Washington, D.C. now. So there have been international efforts. Thailand is often also cited as a place where a comprehensive, multifaceted program to address what is a venereal disease, for the most part, have been effective at reducing rates.
A similarity between HIV and syphilis is that we have not been successful in developing a vaccine for either one. And diseases that we tend to wipe out, well, smallpox, the only real, without vaccination. And the polio campaign worldwide, and again, as a global health person, you may want to comment on this. How many times have they extended the deadline for the eradication of polio worldwide?
Right. a lot. And I think that there are certainly complex social reasons relative to vaccine hesitancy and political issues facing the polio eradication campaign, but also very interesting biological mechanisms that sometime we should talk about here.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our hour, but I'm actually glad the word undetestable stayed up on the screen, because I think, you know, some of the work in this area needs to be open, frank conversation about these kinds of issues, but also keeping in mind how persons with or associated with such diseases feel, and what we as a society and as healthcare providers can do to make the environment more hospitable to their care and their treatment and the eradication of these diseases. I'd like you to join us next week for Echoes of the Heart. A cardiologist discovers his patients through photography and poetry. We'll have UVA alum Joe Gasho, cardiologist from Penn State University School of Medicine, and recently retired Julie Connolly from Internal Medicine and Humanities and Bioethics. So please join us then. And now please thank John Parascandola and Becca Dillingham.